Blood coated her teeth. The cold edge of a training blade pressed hard against her throat. The instructor's mocking voice echoed across the mat. "Ring the bell, sweetheart. It's over." But Jessica didn't reach for the brass bell. She reached for his wrist. What happened next stunned the entire command. The Pacific Ocean off the coast of Coronado, California, doesn't care about your gender, your politics, or your pride. At 3 in the morning, the surf is a freezing, indifferent grinder that strips away everything but the raw will to survive. For Jessica Hayes, the cold was the easy part. Jess was the only woman in basic underwater demolition, SEAL, C, Class 289. Out of the 140 men who had started day 1, only 42 remained. And out of the brass in Washington who had quietly pushed for a female candidate to finally break the ultimate glass ceiling, exactly 0 were here in the sand, carrying a 200-pound rubber Zodiac boat on their heads. She was entirely alone. Petty Officer Ryan Cobb, a former linebacker from Texas with a jawline like an anvil, marched beside her under the suffocating weight of the boat. He didn't hate her, but he didn't trust her either. In the teams, trust is currency, and to men like Cobb, Jess was an unproven liability. Behind him was Seaman Wyatt Reed, a quiet farm kid from Idaho who mostly kept his eyes glued to the sand, too exhausted to engage in the politics of Class 289. But the real threat wasn't her classmates. It was Senior Chief Kalen Brody. Brody was a legend in the Naval Special Warfare community, a veteran of Ramadi, Fallujah, and a dozen classified night raids he wasn't legally allowed to talk about. He had a face mapped with shrapnel scars and a disposition that made a cornered rattlesnake look friendly. Brody was an absolute purist. To him, the SEAL teams were a sacred, blood-forged brotherhood. The introduction of a woman into his pipeline wasn't just a political stunt, it was a desecration. It was a liability that would get good men killed in the dark. From the first week of first phase, Brody had made it his personal mission to break her. He didn't haze her. Hazing was strictly prohibited and closely monitored by the base commander, Captain Henderson. Instead, Brody used the curriculum as a scalpel. He weaponized the standards. When it was time for log PT, Brody ensured Jess was paired with the tallest, heaviest men in the class, forcing her to bear a disproportionate amount of the crushing weight to compensate for the height difference. During surf torture, when the class linked arms in the freezing water, Brody would stand on the beach with his megaphone and casually mention how much warmer the barracks were, keeping his eyes deadlocked on Jess. Yet, she didn't quit, she didn't complain, she just suffered in absolute silence. By the time Class 289 entered third phase land warfare and close quarters combat on San Clemente Island, the physical exhaustion had morphed into a deep, hollow psychological fatigue. The focus shifted from enduring pain to inflicting lethality. This was Brody's absolute domain: room clearing, weapons manipulation, and hand-to-hand combatives. "The enemy does not care about your equality," Brody barked during a morning briefing, pacing the front of the matted training room. His eyes swept over the bruised, battered faces of the remaining candidates before stopping on Jess. "The enemy is a 220-pound insurgent high on amphetamines who wants to tear your throat out. If you cannot dominate that space, you die. If you cannot neutralize that threat, your teammates die." He walked slowly down the aisle, stopping inches from where Jess sat cross-legged on the mats. "Some of you think you're special because you survived Hell Week," Brody whispered, though the entire room could hear him. "Hell Week just proves you can take a beating. Third phase proves whether or not I can trust you with a loaded weapon behind my back. And right now, I wouldn't trust some of you to hold my coffee." The tension in the room was suffocating. Every man in Class 289 knew exactly who Brody was talking to. Jess kept her eyes locked dead ahead, her face a mask of stone. She knew the game. React, and she proved him right. Show emotion, and she was too volatile. She had spent the last 5 months walking a razor's edge, modulating her voice, hiding her pain, and fighting twice as hard just to be considered average. But as they moved into the close quarters combat CQC pit that afternoon, Jess knew the quiet endurance wasn't going to be enough anymore. Brody was done trying to freeze her out. He was going to physically break her out. The CQC pit on San Clemente Island smelled of stale sweat, ozone, and old blood. It was a massive warehouse filled with heavy bags, tactical dummies, and a sprawling expanse of dense black mats. This was where candidates learned the brutal, unglamorous reality of hand-to-hand combat. No martial arts movie spin kicks, just eye gouges, joint destruction, and knife defense. What Brody didn't know, what Captain Henderson didn't know, and what the entire Department of the Navy had failed to realize, because her file had been heavily redacted by a 3-letter agency, was that Jessica Hayes wasn't just a former collegiate athlete who wanted to push her limits. 4 years before stepping onto the grinder at BUD-S, Jess had been quietly recruited by an off-the-books intelligence support cell attached to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her cover was a low-level diplomatic aide, but her actual job involved inserting into hostile urban environments to extract compromised assets. Because she operated entirely alone, without the backing of a quick reaction force, she had been sent to a black site in Virginia for specialized training. For 3 years, Jess didn't learn standard military combatives. She was trained by former Israeli Shayatet 13 commandos and black program contractors in Filipino Kali and Raw, street-lethal Krav Maga. She was taught how to fight men twice her size not by matching their strength, but by weaponizing their momentum, targeting nervous systems, and dismantling their anatomy in seconds. But when she transitioned back to the conventional Navy to pursue a SEAL contract driven by a promise she had made to her late brother, a Navy corpsman killed in Helmand, she buried her past. She wanted to own the Trident the right way, as a sailor, not an intelligence ghost. So, during BUD-S, she deliberately handicapped herself. She threw standard, textbook punches. She grappled exactly the way the Navy instructors taught her to grapple. She hid the lethal, hyper-violent instinct that lived in the dark corners of her mind. Brody, however, was about to rip that door wide open. "All right, ladies," Brody announced, stepping onto the center mat holding a heavy, hard rubber training knife. "Today is blade survival. The scenario is simple. Your primary weapon is down, your secondary is jammed. The enemy closes the distance with a blade. You do not fight him. You disarm him, you drop him, and you finish him. Do you understand?" "Hooyah, Senior Chief," the class roared in unison. Brody spent the next hour walking the class through the drills. He demonstrated brutal, heavy-handed strikes. The men paired up, sweating and grunting as they threw each other into the mats. Jess was paired with Cobb. Despite his size, Cobb was surprisingly fair in the drills. He gave her real resistance but didn't take cheap shots. Jess easily managed his momentum, taking him down with textbook precision. Brody watched from the corner, his jaw tight. This wasn't the narrative he wanted. "Stop," Brody suddenly barked. The room went dead silent. 41 men froze in place. Brody walked slowly toward the center of the mat, his boots sinking slightly into the foam. He pointed the rubber training knife directly at Jess. Hayes, front and center. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Cobb shot Jess a quick, nervous glance. Jess stood up, wiping sweat from her brow, and stepped to the center of the mat. She assumed the standard ready stance, hands up, chin tucked. "You're surviving, Hayes," Brody said, his voice dangerously low. "But you're surviving because your classmates are treating you like a porcelain doll." Cobb is pulling his strikes. He's afraid of hurting the Navy's shiny PR project. "That's not true, Senior Chief," Cobb blurted out, breaking protocol. "Shut your mouth, Cobb, or I'll have you doing burpees in the surf until you puke up your own soul," Brody roared, not even looking at him. Brody turned his predatory gaze back to Jess. In the real world, the man with the knife doesn't care about your historical milestones. He wants to see the life leave your eyes. Let's see how you handle a real threat. Brody didn't wait for her to acknowledge. He didn't say go. He simply exploded forward. At 210 pounds of pure, seasoned muscle, Brody moved with terrifying speed. He bypassed the standard instructional entry and threw a heavy, looping right hook, followed by a vicious thrust with the training blade aimed straight for her ribs. Jess fell back on her Navy training, stepping off the center line and attempting to block the strike with her forearm. But Brody was intentionally using his mass. He crashed into her, breaking her guard. He drove a hard knee into her thigh, a dead leg strike that sent a shockwave of white-hot pain up her spine. Jess stumbled back, her leg buckling. Brody was on her in a flash, grabbing the collar of her tactical shirt and slamming her hard onto the mat. The air rushed out of her lungs in a violent gasp. "Is that it?" Brody yelled, standing over her. "Is that what you're bringing to my teams? Get up." Jess rolled, clutching her bruised ribcage, and forced herself back to her feet. The room was deathly quiet. Wyatt Reed was gripping the edge of a heavy bag, looking sick to his stomach. The men knew this had crossed the line from a training evolution into a public execution.
"Come on, Hayes," Brody taunted, tossing the training blade from his right hand to his left.
"Ring the bell. Go back to the fleet. Tell them it was too cold, too hard, too unfair." Jess looked at the man across from her. Her leg throbbed. The metallic taste of blood seeped from a cut inside her cheek, where her teeth had slammed together. She looked into Brody's eyes and saw the absolute certainty of her defeat. He wasn't going to stop until she was physically broken or verbally surrendered. The standard textbook moves wouldn't work on him. He knew them all, and he had the physics to overpower them. If she wanted to survive this mat, the Navy's golden girl had to disappear. The ghost had to wake up. "Ready, Senior Chief," Jess said. Her voice wasn't a yell. It was a cold, flat whisper that sent a strange shiver down Ryan Cobb's spine. Brody let out a guttural yell and charged. This time, he didn't aim for the body. He brought the blade in high, a slashing arc aimed at her throat, meant to force her backward into a compromising fall where he could pin and humiliate her. He expected her to retreat. He expected her to block. Instead, Jess stepped in. She moved inside the arc of the blade, closing the distance so fast, Brody's brain couldn't register the geometry. She didn't reach for the knife. She didn't try to stop his arm. She aggressively bypassed his defense, driving the palm of her left hand brutally upward, catching Brody under the chin. The strike snapped his head back, instantly disrupting his equilibrium and blurring his vision. Simultaneously, Jess's right hand shot out, moving with the terrifying, practiced fluidity of a seasoned killer. She didn't grab his wrist. She hooked the crook of his elbow, stepping deeply behind his lead leg. Using his own massive forward momentum against him, she violently pivoted her hips. It wasn't a standard takedown, it was a devastating, rotational throw designed to completely detach the opponent from their center of gravity. Brody's feet left the ground. All 210 pounds of the battle-hardened senior chief went airborne. He slammed into the mat with a thunderous crack that echoed off the warehouse walls. The impact knocked the wind out of him in a violent wheeze. But Jess wasn't done. Before Brody could even process the ceiling spinning above him, Jess dropped all of her body weight directly onto his trapped right arm. She locked his wrist against her hip and applied a brutal, agonizing fulcrum across his elbow joint. With her free hand, she snatched the rubber training blade as it slipped from his stunned fingers. In a fraction of a second, she flipped the blade into a reverse grip. When Brody finally gasped for air and his vision cleared, he found himself pinned flat on his back. His arm was trapped in an armbar so tight that 1 millimeter of pressure would snap his radius in half. And resting gently, perfectly against his carotid artery, was the edge of his own training blade. Jess leaned in, her face inches from his. The blood on her teeth made her smile look terrifying. "You're dead, Senior Chief," she whispered. For 10 seconds, the entire CQC facility was completely paralyzed. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. 41 elite SEAL candidates stared in absolute, mind-numbing shock. The invincible Senior Chief Brody, the terror of Third Phase, had just been flawlessly dismantled, disarmed, and pseudo-executed by the 5'7" woman they had been carrying boats for. Then, the heavy metal doors of the warehouse violently banged open. The heavy metal doors of the CQC warehouse violently banged open. A shaft of blinding California sunlight cut through the dusty air, illuminating the frozen tableau on the mats. Standing in the doorway was Captain Arthur Henderson, the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center. He was a man who rarely left the administrative buildings during Third Phase unless someone was dead or going to federal prison. But it wasn't Captain Henderson who made Jessica's blood run cold. It was the man standing directly behind him. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place on the gritty military installation. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his cold, calculating eyes locked instantly onto Jess. It was Thomas Reynolds. He was a senior handler for the Defense Intelligence Agency's Clandestine Operations Branch. He was the man who had recruited Jess, trained her, and sent her into the darkest corners of the Middle East. He was also the man she had completely ghosted to join the Navy. "Stand down, candidate," Captain Henderson barked, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. Jess didn't move immediately. Her adrenaline was redlining, the combat instinct still screaming in her ears. Slowly, deliberately, she released the agonizing pressure on Brody's elbow. She pulled the training blade away from his throat, tossed it onto the mat, and stepped back, snapping into the rigid position of attention. Senior Chief Brody stayed on the mat for a long moment, massaging his neck and rolling his right shoulder. He looked at the rubber knife, then up at Jess. The seething anger that usually defined his features was entirely gone. In its place was a look of profound, unsettling realization. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten her with a washout. Brody slowly got to his feet, brushed the foam dust off his uniform, and looked her dead in the eye. "Good kill, Hayes," Brody whispered. A collective, silent shockwave hit the other 41 candidates. Ryan Cobb's jaw practically hit the floor. Wyatt Reed let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Brody, the purist, the ultimate gatekeeper of the SEAL Brotherhood, had just validated her lethality in front of the entire class. "Senior Chief Brody, Candidate Hayes," Captain Henderson called out, marching toward the center of the room. "My office, now." 10 minutes later, Jess found herself standing rigidly at attention on the plush carpet of the commanding officer's office. Brody stood beside her, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes darting suspiciously between Henderson and the man in the suit. Thomas Reynolds walked over to Henderson's desk, casually picking up a heavy, black dossier. "I have to admit, Jessica," Reynolds said, his voice smooth and devoid of any military cadence, "when you sent me a resignation letter citing a desire to serve in the conventional forces, I assumed you were joining an intelligence battalion. Imagine my surprise when the Pentagon flagged your name in a Bud S roster." Brody frowned, looking at Jess. "Who the hell is this guy, Hayes?" "That's classified, Senior Chief," Reynolds answered for her, dropping the file onto the desk. "What you need to know is that Candidate Hayes is not who she claims to be. The Navy thinks they recruited a collegiate athlete. In reality, they borrowed one of the most highly trained extraction specialists in the clandestine community. She spent 3 years working off the books in Beirut and Damascus. Her hand-to-hand proficiency isn't a hobby. It's an occupational requirement for staying alive in environments where backup doesn't exist." Brody turned slowly to Jess. The pieces were suddenly snapping together in his mind, the perfect robotic adherence to the Navy's textbook combatives. The way she absorbed punishment without ever losing her tactical composure. She hadn't been struggling to learn the material. She had been struggling to hide her muscle memory. "Why didn't you disclose this?" Henderson asked, his tone stern. "Falsifying a background profile is grounds for immediate expulsion from this program." "With all due respect, sir," Jess replied, her voice steady and clear. "My DIA file is heavily compartmentalized. I was legally barred from disclosing my operational history to conventional recruiters. Furthermore, I didn't want a free pass. I wanted to earn my place on the grinder, exactly like the men standing next to me." Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. "Well, the game is over, Jess. We have a Tier 1 crisis in Yemen. An asset you previously handled has been compromised. The extraction window is closing, and you are the only operator he trusts. I've already spoken with the Secretary of the Navy. Your Bud S orders are being terminated. You're coming back to the agency." The words hit Jess like a physical blow. She had endured months of freezing surf, broken toes, sleep deprivation, and the suffocating pressure of being the first woman to make it this far. She was only weeks away from the finish line, from honoring the promise she made to her brother. To have it ripped away now, not by the training, but by bureaucracy, was unacceptable. "I decline the transfer, sir," Jess said, locking eyes with Reynolds. Reynolds let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "You don't have a choice, Jessica. The paperwork is already signed. You are an intelligence asset. This little Navy experiment is over." Before Jess could argue, Senior Chief Brody took a heavy step forward, placing himself physically between Jess and the DIA handler. "Hold on a second," Brody growled, his voice vibrating with authority. He looked at Captain Henderson. "Sir, with respect, this candidate belongs to Class 289. She has endured first phase, she survived Hell Week, and 10 minutes ago, she put me on my back in front of my own students. She didn't quit in the surf, and she sure as hell isn't quitting because some spook in a suit forged a permission slip." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "Senior Chief, you are out of your depth. This is a matter of national security." "My SEAL teams are national security," Brody fired back, leaning in close to Reynolds. "I've spent the last 5 months trying to break her. I threw everything I had at her, and she didn't just survive it. She hid her true capability so she wouldn't embarrass my instructors. That is discipline. That is control. That is exactly the kind of quiet professional I want wearing a trident." Brody turned to Henderson. "Captain, If you pull her out of my pipeline now, you are robbing the naval special warfare community of a lethal asset. She stays, or I hand in my anchor today." The room fell into a deafening silence. Jess stared at Brody in utter disbelief. The man who had been her greatest tormentor had just put his entire career on the line to defend her place in the teams. Captain Henderson looked at Brody, then at Jess, and finally at Reynolds. Henderson reached across his desk, picked up the transfer orders Reynolds had brought in, and slowly, deliberately, tore them in half. "Tell the Secretary of the Navy to route his complaints through my chain of command," Henderson said coldly. "Candidate Hayes belongs to the SURF now. Dismissed." The ultimate test of the SEAL pipeline wasn't just completing BUD-S. It was surviving the culminating field training exercise known as the QLEX. It was a brutally realistic, live-fire scenario designed to push candidates to the absolute edge. It was 0200 hours. The sea state off the California coast was violently churning. Jess, Ryan Cobb, and Wyatt Reed were part of an assault element executing a visit, board, search, and seizure (VBSS) operation on a rusted cargo ship. Senior Chief Kalen Brody was on the catwalk above, evaluating. The insertion required the team to approach the moving hull in an 11-meter rigid hull inflatable boat, RHIB, and scale a flimsy wire-caving ladder while the ocean threw them around. 30 seconds, the coxswain yelled over the crashing waves. Jess was second in the stack, right behind Cobb. The RHIB slammed aggressively against the steel hull. Cobb grabbed the wildly swinging ladder. "Up, up, up," he yelled. Jess followed immediately, keeping her tactical spacing tight. They were 20 feet above the black water when the unpredictable sea state turned lethal. A massive, rogue swell caught the RHIB, violently shoving it upward against the hull. The impact sent a violent shockwave up the wire rungs. Cobb lost his grip. With a shouted curse, he peeled off the ladder, hitting the RHIB's gunwale with a sickening crunch before tumbling into the freezing water between the boat and the massive steel hull. Man overboard! Being trapped between a heavily armored RHIB and a steel ship in this sea state was a death sentence. The boat would crush a man in seconds. Brody hit his emergency radio. "Abort! Cease fire! Man in the water!" But Jess didn't wait for the safety stand-down. She unclipped her heavy primary weapon, letting it drop on its sling, and pushed off the ladder. She plummeted into the icy darkness, hitting the water just feet from Cobb. The cold was paralyzing, but Jess kicked hard, fighting the brutal suction of the waves. She found Cobb sinking, unconscious from the impact, his gear dragging him down. Jess dove deep, grabbing the heavy nylon drag handle on his plate carrier. Above her, the terrifying shriek of the RHIB scraping against the cargo ship echoed in the dark. The swell was bringing the boat down directly on top of them. Using every ounce of explosive power, Jess kicked sideways, dragging Cobb's dead weight out from under the shadow of the hull just a fraction of a second before the heavy RHIB slammed down where they had just been. Jess broke the surface, gasping violently, holding Cobb's head above the water. "Throw a line!" she screamed. Reed hurled a rescue rope. It took 3 men to haul Cobb's heavy body over the gunwales. Jess climbed up under her own power. Cobb was bleeding heavily but breathing. Brody rappelled down, his face pale. "You good, Hayes?" Jess looked up, spitting salt water. "I'm good, Senior Chief. What's our time limit on this target?" Brody let out an incredulous laugh. "Assault team is green to continue," he radioed, then pulled her to her feet. "Lead the way, Hayes." 6 months later, 28 men and 1 woman stood in pristine dress whites on the grinder. When Brody walked down the line holding the coveted gold tridents, he stopped at Jess. He didn't just pin it. He drove the sharp golden pins deeply into her chest, a painful, forbidden tradition of absolute respect known as a blood pinning. Jess didn't flinch. "You earned this, teammate," Brody whispered. She wasn't a political experiment anymore. She was a United States Navy SEAL. If this story of grit, resilience, and breaking impossible barriers inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they can overcome any obstacle, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true life stories of absolute badassery. Drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to step onto the mat? See you in the next one.